So I admit this story of Nicki Minaj and her surprise appearance at Erica Kirk's Turning Point USA America Fest has piqued my interest regarding some of what I've already covered on this platform, but also am endeavoring in some sort of slow motion capacity to engage in some of my own work in the future. So yeah, so some of the liberal progressive left YouTube spaces had fun with this event and making fun of some of its contents and Erica Kirk's misspeak or Freudian slip and self-referring as grifter and all of that. But for me, it points to something else related to this, what I think is often an encouraged confusion around symbolic or cultural power, buying power, purchasing power, and actual political power. Initially, so, Nicki Minaj shows up at this event condemning Gavin Newsom, calling him new scum, and what are his politics around trans people. She had, during their on-stage discussion, the queen of rap got candid about her religious journey and her decision to speak up against the slaughtering of Christians in Nigeria. We're not going to back down anymore. She said her Nigerian pastor is reporting that Nigerian Christians are being brutalized and worse. Earlier this month, the rap icon tore into Newsom for his stance on transgender children. Imagine being the guy running on wanting to see trans kids, she said. Not even a trans adult would run on that. Normal adults want to see happy, safe kids. Although there was a little bit of what they report here as a gaffle when she referred to J.D. Vance as an assassin. You have amazing role models like the assassin J.D. Vance, our vice president. She said before catching herself and recoiling. So I've discussed this book a little bit before, Professor Aria Halliday's By Black, How Black Women Transformed U.S. Pop Culture. And we've talked a little bit about how she did not apparently want to interview with me and discuss her work with me, but did appear on Mark Anthony Neal's platform. The two of them had, what I would argue and have argued was a little bit of fun and took a shot or two at my work, but neither have actually engaged my argument around buying power. And I think both have missed the argument. And I'll put the link to that video in the show description as well. But I think Professor Halliday's chapter here, A Black Barbie's Moment, speaks a little bit to where I'm both a little bit confused about her ultimate argument, that is Professor Halliday's, but am a little more clear on my own criticism regarding discussion of celebrity, popularity, pop culture, and in this case, Black women's ability to have some sort of meaningful impact on Black girls and Black self-concept. Professor Halliday makes an argument that Minaj has had an advanced interaction with her Black consumer base, while also acknowledging the complicated context in which all of this is occurring. So, but just quickly before we get to the book, what I am trying to say in sum here is that whatever prefix people want to affix to the word power, the only one that really means anything, and therefore the only one we never see materialize as associated with the term, is political. Cultural, symbolic, buying, purchasing, spending are all acceptable for discussion or consideration. But we are never meant to discuss, never mind have, political power, the ability to develop, enact, or impose policy that defines and redistributes resources so as to impact the material and lived experience of a given community. Nicki Minaj can so easily, and has, I would argue, been so easily promoted as a symbol of cultural power, but yet must attach herself politically to whatever or whichever wing of an existing ruling elite can make use of her. As a metaphor for small or Black-owned businesses, her only option to make real or material her value is through the sale of herself as metaphor to the highest bidder. And that there being no politically left equivalent to the abuse of her celebrity, as we've seen by Erica Kirk and the right, I think a more appropriate and critical look at the politics of celebrity and pop culture is appropriate than what we often see in discussions of or symbolic power. All right, so when we look at a little bit here at Professor Halliday's book again, just as a reminder, she uses this concept where, as she says here, she has coined the phrase embodied objectification, which she says is meant to describe the process through which Black women cultural producers infuse products for mass consumption with the experiences, aesthetics, and intra-racial politics while specifically seeking Black girls and women as their target consumers. This understanding of Black women's self-objectification must be foundational to how we theorize the relationship between producer and consumer, race and the mass market, and Black women's and girls' consumption of mass-produced products. So again, I'll refer everybody also back to my recent discussion with Marcel Rosa Salas about advertising and the racial information system and how these concepts of race and, I would argue, gender, sexual identity, religion, etc., are very much social constructs based in settler colonialism that are then played and preyed upon by advertisers and marketers to manipulate us and manipulate our public opinion, always and ever more away from radical politics and to just sort of a blind consumption and exploitation of labor. So when Professor Halliday is using embodied objectification to look at how Black women cultural producers infuse products for mass consumption with their experiences, aesthetics, and intra-racial politics, while specifically seeking Black girls and women, what I think is missing is a more critical view of what that means. What does it mean to, for instance, be socially constructed as a Black woman? To then be a cultural producer infusing products that are not owned by Black people, produced by Black people, whose the wealth through the sale and consumption of which does not go to Black people, but is put out for mass consumption and private accumulated wealth. When those socially constructed experiences are infused in those products, which are then used to sell and market those products, but there is some desire specifically to speak to intra-racial politics targeting Black girls without a radical assessment of what's going on here, a critically radical assessment of what's going on here, I think we end up with confusion about what popularity, celebrity mean, and then we end up being confused or disappointed when so many of them move rightward. Of course, the famous examples of James Brown, I've talked recently about Snoop and the co-optation of Kendrick and the Black Eyed Peas by Obama, and then Kendrick again by Jay-Z and the NFL and the Super Bowl. There is or Drake has now had an arc moving more into red pill social media space. There's and those who move to the left have their careers destroyed or worse. So that's why I'm saying there's always more room to the right in the Erica Kirk world for a Nicki Minaj than there would be for anything the equivalent of which on an actual left. At best, you might get the Democratic Party co-optation and Megan Thee Stallion twerking for Kamala. So I'll continue to work with Halliday's book here because, again, I think there's so much that is interesting and important said in it. I think it minus some, I do think important interpretation or framing, but as I work on this slow motion moving project, I would like to come back to this juxtaposition, I think, between what she does here and Erica Edwards does on the other side of terror. But that's an ongoing project and discussion. But in this chapter, A Black Barbie's Moment, Nicki Minaj and the Struggle for Cultural Dominance, there are some very interesting points raised about Nicki Minaj's rise, and I think the role and function that she plays as a celebrity that lead her more easily, and I think and more logically, to where she would end up allowing herself to be paraded around and so abused. And never mind all the contradictions, but of her own immigrant background and siding up with the most anti-immigrant side of the population. I mean, all it's wild, but whatever. But anyway, here Halliday says, I illustrate how Black women's embodied objectification utilizes the ideological connection to Black consumers in their own creative process, which is then commandeered and thus altered in the global popular consumer market, especially by white performers. So again, it's always odd for me to hear discussions of agency and power of any form within this context where the market is developed by whites, is owned by whites, the dominant consumers are white, the target audience is white, uh, the maintenance of celebrity requires white support and market support and acceptance. And so it's not, I would argue, so much that anyone commandeers this ideological connection. I would argue the ideological connection between Black consumers and Black creative producers is itself a construct not in their own making and not in their own control, not for their own benefit. If anything, the relationship between Black cultural producers and a Black audience itself, that relationship has to be commandeered and taken over and taken back or usurped from its initial purpose. The Black consumer is rarely, if ever, the it cannot be in any sustained way the dominant target for consumption. By framing Minaj's embodied objectification and utilization of prominent white icons like Barbie and Cinderella, as well as how others have used her likeness to sell their own products or comment on U.S. political positioning, I question how and why certain representations of Black women, while oppositional and perhaps even revolutionary for us, continue to be used to serve particular imaginative processes that demonize and dehumanize Black women writ large. And this is sort of the conundrum that I see and struggle with in terms of engaging Halliday's work here, that I think is also emblematic and reflects the more popular struggle in the political imagination or the popular opinion of Black consumers and audiences, many of whom are the targets of such popular cultural product like Minaj, but are made unaware of the political context and of alternatives to what Black womanhood might look like. So it's not like there is a wide range of Blackness and Black womanhood that is offered to Black consumers or other consumers for them to select, from which to select and then emulate. It is a very narrowed set into which all of this occurs. Again, so I don't know how any of what is produced in this context could be seen as oppositional or revolutionary. Certainly not in any meaningful or sustained way, and not in any way that overturns or counterbalances the negative connotations and political uses of the popular presence and place of Minaj and other celebrities. So, for instance, when Halliday quotes Jennifer Dawn Whitney and says that who she says contends that Nicki Minaj's use of the plasticity of Barbie in her music puts forth a playful alternative to the static Black doll representations imaged by Mattel, another opportunity for Black girls to realize their place within American culture as beautiful and diverse, full humans. Yeah, I'm saying that the plasticity that Minaj is engaging in the look of Barbie is what allows her to also be malleable and reshapeable and vague, ambiguous enough to be rebranded and redesigned politically in favor of Erica Kirk and Turning Point USA, at the same time having Black girls and audiences be encouraged to project onto her some sort of progress or power or dominance just by the sheer fact of her popularity and presence. And that's what I'm saying. Without these interruptive, radical, interpretive reframing or appropriate framing of the situation, it leaves, I think, too much of a confused and ambiguous, malleable through its plasticity analyses that allow for anyone to argue that there's any sort of genuine power in the presence of these celebrities. Here again, the point is made with this example from the Pink Friday album, where Minaj is described as wearing an Afrocentric outfit that is meant to subvert and reify, that simultaneously subverts and reifies the tropes surrounding Barbie, where she's depicted as an Afrocentric Barbie doll. Because, as Whitney points out, Barbie has a certain blankness that enables interpretive versatility, Minaj is able to critique, affirm, and resituate Barbie's importance in the American cultural landscape through her Pink Friday cover and performances. So this is where I struggle with that the simultaneity being described here for me is a massive contradiction and a problem, that you can't be critiquing and affirming. You can't be critiquing and resituating the importance of. And again, the blankness that and interpretive versatility that is that Barbie is said to represent is a marketing ploy to get initially white girls to project themselves onto this doll. And here we're seeing the same thing, and we're being asked to project onto Nicki Minaj's image and black celebrity all of whatever black girl or black people's radical imaginations could contain. And again, this is a contradiction that should be understood as hostile, where the radical imagination is targeted for limitation. So when Halliday says Minaj's claiming use and critique of Barbie is therefore in line with black satirical traditions, Minaj affirms Barbie's importance by using her as an inspiration, yet critiques Barbie's own plasticity through satire. I'm again seeing that if it's not an explicit condemnation, it's going to be misunderstood and will just be seen as a sort of blackening and a cooling, making cool of something that is essentially white. And again, not upsetting and challenging the ownership, the wealth producing capacity of selling and producing and marketing these images and dolls and whatever. And it certainly doesn't lead to any sort of radical redistribution of that wealth, and then doesn't lead to some sort of establishment and identity and clarity around radical ideology and politics that can then prevent someone from being so manipulated as to be teaming up with Turning Point USA. Minaj is quoted as saying here, as a little girl growing up in Southside Jamaica, Queens, if anyone would have told me I'd have my own perfume one day and be able to inspire young black girls everywhere to go to Macy's or Nordstrom and see their face staring back at them, I wouldn't believe them. An example of embodied objectification, Minaj explains her own disbelief in her ability to infuse cultural products with her likeness and therefore connect to black girls when they encounter them. Now, admittedly, I only am able to read this as something that should be massively criticized, not looked for to demonstrate some sort of balance or agency or mutual power. The ability to take someone out of poverty and have them identify with the very structures, Macy's and Nordstrom, that produce that inequality and want to be seen and included in that, as opposed to radically critical of it, is part of what I think is the problem here, and part of the co-optive process that I don't think is, I don't see being properly clarified in this work or works similar to it in their discussion of celebrity, popular culture, and race. So then when Halliday asks if, as Minaj has admitted in her own creative process, 21st century black women cultural producers understand that their aesthetic choices have an impact on the identity development of black girls across the diaspora through consumptive practices and play, and if they desire to help black girls and women accept themselves as beautiful, how then can we understand her continued affirmation and maintenance of white supremacist and patriarchal performances of femininity? The answer, I maintain, is that Minaj recognizes the importance of maintaining allegiances to mainstream consumers and audiences because of the symbolic importance of whiteness and white beauty aesthetics in the United States. In which case, she would then recognize, or should be encouraged to recognize, how she's being manipulated by both those who would want her to produce a positive or a reimagined positive version of a blacker form of pre-existing mainstream, mainstay intellectual property, like Cinderella, Barbie, etc. And then we would also see how this allegiance to mainstream consumers and audiences could allow her to be very easily, and others to be very easily manipulated to more to the political right. As again, being mainstream means appeasing affluent white executives, investors, and consumers. Halliday writes, according to Bell Hooks, the acknowledged other must assume recognizable forms, since consumer culture promises to show the way to interact with the other. And again, this is an important point. The way to interact with the other is to socially construct the other as inferior and as in a limited, narrow way, and then to have that individual or community perform their popular culture and for mass consumption in a way that appeases that social construct, because the other is itself a construct and is set up to be judged by what is considered the norm. So in this case, the other being Black women is set up and socially constructed and defined by white, mostly affluent, mostly men, and then is set out to perform in that way, to say this is how we want to, this is how we intend to interact with you, as commodity, as performer, as a colonially inspired product performing for the colonizer. So again, this is where I've always struggled with how authors and or anyone are extract some form of power from this, or claim some extracted power from this. Black women cultural producers' aesthetic choices communicate that even though capitalist discourses dictate that anything is sellable in our society, there are some symbols of beauty, femininity, and sexuality that will sell better than others because of how they occupy and even perhaps narrowly expand the set of already recognizable and at times relatable representations. So again, we're back to where Halliday and I feel like we're back to an agreement, because to me, that makes the point that the socially constructed norm must be recognizable in what is going to be a popular representation of that. So this idea then that Nicki Minaj or anyone else can enter that space and make some sort of radical intervention while maintaining an allegiance to those same consumers doesn't, I can't, I get stuck there. We then get a little bit here that I think dovetails with my problem with this broader hip hop narrative that has evolved, that I think misleads and has confused some analyses around the history of hip hop and again, celebrity, pop culture, etc. But I think even where we may disagree, Professor Halliday points to some issues with that narrative that help, I think, explain why some would be confused by Minaj's ultimate allegiance with Erica Kirk. Now the most popular global music genre because of the ways that other marginalized people can and do identify or disidentify with narratives of struggle and otherness, hip hop artists bespeak a commitment to naming protest and trauma as well as collective expressions of pleasure. This purposeful and economically successful expression has allowed for artists like Sean Jay-Z Carter and Sean Diddy Combs to create business empires. From corner boys to billionaires, Carter and Combs represent a recognizable form of hip hop that is believed to be more authentic when it exemplifies Black striving narratives. Left out of all of this, again, is the importance of the colonial context, the relationship the music industry plays in all of that, the role, the relationship of the industry and corporations themselves to the both the rise, popularity, global distribution, and wealth extraction from these communities in creating what may be described here as empires for Combs and Carter, but are really expanding the empires of those Carter and Combs have always and ever worked for. The Universals, primarily, I think Universal Music Group for both of them, but uh, but that broader structure, and then those going up the scale, up the line from them as well. Like many Black entrepreneurs at the turn of the 20th century who sought material gain through affiliation with larger, usually white corporations, Black artists know that recognition by a major label can improve their financial circumstances. Again, this is the colonial relationship that I don't think gets enough critical exploration in discussions such as these, that similar to the point previously made about Nicki Minaj aligning with Erica Kirk, and the small business or black-owned business having to do the same thing with broader white-owned businesses. This is this is the point being made here, that those larger businesses and more powerful structures are the determinant here. They are the ones who are determining popularity, wealth definition, distribution, so on and so forth, and then the forms of popularity that will be acceptable. Capitalizing on her Barbie status as well as the well-established reference of rappers as rags to riches successes, Minaj relayed her own Cinderella story in her music video Moment for Life. But again, taking that the Horatio Alger mythology for the white world has been rebranded in black capitalist form for black communities for a long time. This idea and re-promoted through the mythological narrative attached to hip hop, that hip hop provided the wealth producing capacity and ability for entrepreneurs to create business empires, and for the black and brown communities to improve their conditions, and even for us to end up with a black president on the heels of decades of hip hop promoting the idea and as Steve Stout called it, the browning of America. Again, the cultural symbolic shift that never is matched by anything approaching a political equivalent. But of course, the rags to riches Horatio Alger story is mythological, especially by now, where it's the likelihood of going from poverty to wealth is almost none. And to the extent that it is possible, it comes at the expense of everybody else having to stay poor. Minaj's narrative privileges the rags to riches arc of Cinderella's life because and this is when Halliday starts to talk about Minaj moving from Barbie to the appropriation of Cinderella, and then eventually into the appropriation of dictatorial Nazi imagery, but all couched as a positive, framing black womanhood and power. Minaj's narrative privileges the rags to riches arc of Cinderella's life because it replicates the rise of artists in the music industry, especially hip hop artists, and because it also mimics the broader capitalist free market fundamental big mythology that anyone can go from rags to riches. So this is why I keep arguing that this black capitalist mythology is rebranded white capitalist mythology. Hip hop as a genre, too, reiterates the narrative importance of steadfast faith in one's own ability and hyper productivity until artists become the hip hop bravado version of Cinderella. That is one encouraged narrative within hip hop, because all the other narratives around revolutionary politics, African cultural preferences, et cetera, and so forth, all of those have been suppressed by the very colonial arrangement and machinations through a music industry that have led us to the popularity of a Nicki Minaj in the first place. The story of hip hop that privileges what we might call hood to mansion narratives sustains the importance of mainstream recognition and notoriety to have made it. Nicki Minaj's presentation of Cinderella visually marks this shift in her career. But what does it mean to have made it? Again, my argument would be that the only reason you have a sustained celebrity, or you're allowed in sustained celebrity, is so that you can eventually walk out on stage with Erica Kirk. In the same way, Snoop could eventually walk out on stage with David Sachs and Donald Trump. So this part here where Professor Halliday is talking about Nicki Minaj and the Moment for Life video and her depiction of a rendition of Cinderella, where she plays with the gender roles and definitions, referring to herself as king, but also as she, her, and then challenges the traditional story of Cinderella needing some man to save her, creating this whole radical critique where the music video creates an imaginative space for Black girls to see themselves as agentive, and creating and curating their destinies as imperfect yet content human beings. In other words, they don't need a man. They don't need certainly a white man. They can overcome. But the one thing that she maintains, that is Nicki Minaj maintains, that Professor Halliday notes, is that the video and the major lessons in Cinderella and the Princess and the Frog promoted Black girl desirability in an interracial coupling, a Black girl's ability to dream, succeed, and the enduring hope that success will occur if she works hard enough. Both narratives in Cinderella and the Princess and the Frog engage the idea that anything is possible if a Black girl works hard enough and knows the right people. So here Halliday is showing us that the Hollywood Disney originals are following, even when they put a black girl in the leading role, that's the standard trope of a woman needing a man and needing a white man, or at least a non-black man, and needing something outside of themselves. But as Halliday points out, contrasted with Minaj's princess moment, these stories culminate with a prince who can manifest a shift in Cinderella Tiana's life rather than simply a return to the decadent life already achieved by Minaj. What I'm saying here that Halliday is pointing out, perhaps even unwittingly, is that what is being promoted as a contrast, as a major shift, are the roles and the definitions of gender, sexuality, race, but not class. So there's still a king, even if she's depicted as a she and a her. There's still this mythology that success, as defined by a capitalist world order, is still achievable if you just work hard enough. That core is unchanged, is unchallenged. All that is changed here is the way that narrative is conveyed through Nicki Minaj as a black woman and her presentation of herself as king and not needing some white man to save her. The moment where Halliday juxtaposes Minaj's version of Cinderella and that of the original shows that the issue is symbolic and cultural, not political. The myth of hard work promises all is left untouched. And this is one of the core points, the issue of class, that is often left out when there is this popular and often encouraged positive depiction of cultural and symbolic power. This section concludes with an interesting discussion by Halliday of how Nicki Minaj sort of built her career using popular, open, welcoming, friendly characterization of characters of Cinderella, Barbie, and the like. Whereas she evolved by the time of the Anaconda album to a more aggressive, harsh, and dictatorial aesthetic, where she writes here, Minaj's Barbs and Kens are soldiers pledging allegiance to her big titties and big butt too. And she uses, as shown here, this very by design Nazi-inspired propaganda imagery, where, as Halliday says, I contend that the video uses an aesthetic, and this is the video for Only, I believe. I contend that the video uses an aesthetic of resistance not only to challenge cultural attitudes towards power, but also to position black women as fully embodied dictators. Going back to my previous point, the cultural power is to have black women assume the aesthetic and the power and position of white male dictators. I understand that Minaj's images provide a propaganda that can influence cultural attitudes towards black women's bodies, reconstituting the ideological relationship between black girls and women as producers and consumers. But again, it leaves me with the question, how can Minaj or anyone reconstitute the producer-consumer relationship without ownership or political power, without that being reconstituted, or it being discussed as necessary as part of a reconstitution? And again, when that doesn't happen, that's how I think that lack of clarity, the ambiguity, the vagueness in that allows for that symbolic cultural representation to be just dragged farther to the right and fully more co-opted by somebody like Erica Kirk and Turning Point USA. So again, just when asked, this is always the contradiction or the struggle that I have with these sort of questions and issues, and why I'll again end where I started and hope to continue these conversations and my own investigation and study and increased understanding of Halliday's argument and those of others around these issues, and then trying to clarify and evolve my own, which essentially is again where I started, that whatever prefix people want to affix to the word power, the only one that really means anything, and therefore the only one we never see materialize as associated with the term, is political. Cultural power, symbolic power, buying power, purchasing power, spending power are all acceptable for discussion or consideration, but we are never meant to discuss, never mind have, political power. That is the ability to develop, enact, or impose policy that defines and redistributes resources so as to impact the material and lived conditions of any given community, and in this case, of course, Black people here in the United States specifically. So why would we end up seeing Nicki Minaj parading around the continent of Africa and Turning Point USA in defense of white right-wing Christianity and politics? Because Minaj can so easily be promoted as a symbol of cultural power, but yet must attach herself politically to whichever wing of an existing ruling elite can make use of her. As a metaphor for smaller Black-owned businesses, her only option to make real or material her value is through the sale of herself as metaphor to the highest bidder. And that's why we need political power and real redistributive politics. And we cannot be constantly lured and cajoled and mollified by symbolic representation or popular celebrity presence or inclusion.